the first thing we're going to talk about is the education system overview. So that is our education system. We deal with all aspects of K-12 education in Alberta, and Alberta Education is proud to support our choice in education, offering students public, separate, francophone, charter, and independent school opportunities. So as you can see up here, there's just an overview of the education ministry with, of course, our minister, Adriana LaGrange, at the top. The bottom row there shows the 6 departments of education. So we'll just go through a little description of all of the different divisions. So first we have our curriculum division. That's the area that provides leadership in establishing provincial standards and guidelines for curriculum for all subjects in grades in the kindergarten to grade 12 education system. It focuses on student learning, division reviews, and revises and maintains provincial programs of study and learning and teaching resources in English and French. And it integrates First Nation, Métis, and Inuit education into our curriculum. The next box is program and system support. This area builds relationships with school authorities and stakeholders. They support school infrastructure, exploring the use of technology to address changing needs in the education system, including inclusive technology. They monitor school authorities for compliance with department requirements on the programming side. And this area includes PASI and student records team. The next box over is our system excellence department. That was where the provincial assessment sector is. That's the area that develops PATs, diploma exams, SLAs, exam administrations, and French assessments. They're also the place that handles teaching and leadership excellence. So they direct and administrate all matters related to teaching excellence, leadership excellence, teacher certification, and they practice assurance in the province of Alberta. This is the team that provides leadership and direction for research in the education system. They provide supports to our ministry engagement initiatives and administering student and teacher engagement initiatives. And they do policy development and corporate planning services for the department. They are also the department that maintains the teacher registry. Our next box over is the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit Education Directorate. This is the division that builds our commitment to First Nation, Métis, and Inuit representation. They enhance our capacity and support on current and future initiatives, and they expand our engagement with First Nation and Métis communities and our education partners in those areas. Our next box over is Strategic Services and Governance. So this division coordinates intergovernmental strategy and provides support for international education. They provide financial and administrative services, contract management, and freedom of information and protection of privacy services for the department. And they provide the legal services and French languages services for the department. And then finally, in the green box on the right, you will see the financial services and capital planning area. That's the area that BOSS is a part of, so that's us. And this also includes budget, financial reporting, school finance. We all used to be part of the Strategic Services and Governance, and there was a little bit of a reshuffle, so we're now under Financial Services and Capital Planning. So we've taken on capital planning as well as the funding analysis and analytics branch. We just have some contact information for you. So if you're ever looking to get a hold of one of these departments, there are 5 branches in financial services that offer stakeholder support, and you will see their contact for each branch here. So starting with Emily Maas, our executive director, she oversees the K-12 Fiscal Oversight Sector. Next, you have our area, which is Rick Grebenstein is our director. So that's business operations and stakeholder support. We will answer questions on governance, compliance monitoring, and transportation. And we are also generally the first point of contact for, if you don't know who to call BOSS. So if you're not sure which area to call, give our department a call and we will direct you to the right place. Our next area is Budget and Fiscal Analysis Branch. They deal with forecasting and work with the Treasury Board and Finance for the yearly budget. This is where costing scenarios and grants are created, and the director there is Alexander Blythe. The Financial Reporting and Accountability Branch, their director is Sarah Brennan. That branch provides guidelines and collects board budgets and audited financial statement information. So this is the department where you direct all of your accounting questions. The School Finance Branch, directed by Damon Tan. This is the branch that reviews and approves funding applications and provides funding payments to school authorities in accordance with legislation, guidelines, and policies. And finally, the Funding Analysis and Analytics Branch. The director there is Jubair Hoki, and they are responsible for determining funding allocations under the new funding model, including WMA calculations. On to the next slide. These are the typical communication protocols between Alberta Education and school authorities for items such as letters, information requests, and budget announcements. So this is just typically who contacts who in the organization, and we recognize that independent schools and private ECS may not use these specific titles in their organization, but because these are the titles that we use to make up our contact list, it's very important that when you're setting up your roles in the provincial education directory, that you do have someone assigned to each of these roles for board chair, superintendent, secretary, treasurer, as well as the head of school role, because those are the roles that we're going to pull when we're trying to send out communications. And it's very important that you have someone listed so that we can make sure you're getting on the right email lists or have the right information to contact your school officials. Now, moving on to the legislation and the related regulations that are relevant to education and specifically to private schools and private ECS operators. These are some of the most important pieces of legislation you'll be working with. They're all available online from the King's Printer. Starting with acts and regulations, the main governing act that we look at is the Education Act. That's the primary piece of legislation that guides school authorities on their responsibilities. And some of the more commonly referred to regulations include the Private Schools Regulation and the Early Childhood Services Regulation. Those are the two that we're here to talk about today. As well as you'll want to be familiar with the Home Education Regulation, if that's something that your school offers, as well as the Student Record Regulation and School Transportation Regulations. The Student Record Regulation describes requirements to keep accurate student records, including the documentation showing citizenship, residency, age, and other school documents. When we choose schools for an enrollment verification, we're looking to ensure compliance with the Student Record Regulation. For the School Transportation Regulation, this outlines the requirements respecting student transportation, as well as the limits on transportation fees. So these are just a few pieces of the regulations that are relevant to education, specifically to you. And we would encourage you to look through these and look through the whole Laws Online catalog to familiarize yourself with these, as well as the other regulations that are available there. There's some policy documents that we would suggest you're familiar with as well. These policy documents help define the expectations that may not be clear from the regulations or from the Act. The Guide to Education, that's developed by Alberta Education for the use of administrators, counselors, teachers, and other parties engaged in the delivery of a quality K-12 education. This is consistent with the objectives and underlying principles of the Education Act, and it contains key requirements and other information for the implementation of education programming and the operation of schools. The next one is the Funding Manual. This is a very important policy document that you will be using, as it contains all of the information on how the calculations are made in order for your school to get funding, as well as the rules that are in place. It assists schools, jurisdictions, charter schools, and accredited funded private schools and private ECS operators to access and understand Alberta Education's funding. It provides the details of the funding that's available for the school year, and it includes the applicable formulas, funding rates, criteria, and reporting requirements. So funding from Alberta Education supports the provision of approved education programs for students and children in the early childhood services all the way up to grade 12. And the next piece of policy that we look at is the Special Education Coding Criteria. This outlines the criteria that assist teachers and administrators in school authorities to identify those early childhood services children in grades 1 to 12 who require additional supports in their educational program. Each category is given a code for the purpose of reporting special education to Alberta Ed, and the need for additional supports can be determined at any time during the school year, but we do of course suggest that you get it in place as early as possible in the school year just to take full advantage of the time that you have with these ECS students. And it does outline the need for what is required in order to put a code on. And for that, we are looking for professional assessments from an independent professional skilled in determining what the child's special needs are. So the private schools regulation and the early childhood services regulation were updated in May of 2022. The Red Tape Reduction Statutes Amendment Act received royal assent May 31st, 2022. This amended the Education Act to enable changes to regulations respecting early childhood services programs and private schools to strengthen the financial controls and to improve governance and accountability to ensure public dollars are used appropriately. You'll see that we went from a very broad type of legislation that just allowed the minister to make regulations. And this one specifies a little more specific focuses on some key areas with a focus on financial integrity and transparent policies and procedures. So the new regulations allow boards to develop, maintain, and review policies for internal controls like segregation of duties, expense reimbursements, the roles and responsibilities of the governing body, and senior managers of the funded private school and matters related to compensation. This enables Alberta Education to reduce oversight of private sources of revenue for these providers and eliminate the collection of unnecessary financial data. It also exempts small ECS operators who receive $250,000 or less from Alberta Education from certain reporting requirements. And this reduces the administrative burden for smaller operators who are at low risk of improper spending and who may struggle to meet additional requirements due to limited resources. These changes authorize the minister to set sanctions for noncompliance and made clearer rules related to governance and financial practices, helping avoid costly and time-consuming investigations from Alberta Education. In terms of compensation, limits have been set on what is allowed for base salary for senior management. And if the base salary or any portion of the base salary of a senior management employee is paid or provided from a grant under the ministerial grants regulation, the amount of the base salary or portion of the base salary cannot be greater than 70% of the maximum base salary applicable in respect to Level 5 board under Schedule 1 to the Superintendent of Schools regulation. There have been some changes made to the financial and governance policies and requirements for board members. These policies include internal controls, such as the segregation of duties, capital assets, the reimbursement of expenses and investments, the roles and responsibilities of the governing body of the funded private school, the roles and responsibilities of senior managers of the funded private school, conflicts of interest, and matters relating to the compensation of senior managers of the funded private school or private ECS that are not addressed by this regulation. The transfer of grants identifies those who the independent schools or ECS operators may transfer grants to when they're received from the ministerial grants regulation. Related party transactions identifies agreements where property and services acquired must be at or below fair market value and dispositions are at or above fair market value. There have been changes related to public disclosure, record retention, and eligibility for grants for both independent schools and private ECS operators. For public disclosures, ensure you pay close attention to the dates that your information must be made available. So you can see in the slide there are several dates noted where you'll have to have your information in place by and publicly disclosed on your websites. These regulation changes also give the Minister of Education the ability and the authority to require an entity to hire an auditor or to sanction independent or ECS operators for non-compliance. There is going to be a phased-in transitionary period for these employment contracts, contractor, and related party agreements. So the changes to compensation agreements for employment contracts, contractor, and related party agreements renewed after this regulation comes into force must be in compliance as of the date shown. Contracts that were already in place prior to June 15th, 2022 can be honored up to the date shown, and all new agreements signed after June 15th, 2022 must be in compliance according to the new requirements, even if they're signed prior to the prescribed date. So just because you're signing a new agreement and it expires before these prescribed dates, if you're signing a new agreement right now, it still has to be in compliance with these dates as shown, or it has to be in compliance with these requirements, even if it's prior to the date. A few other changes that are just notable. The changes to the 2022-23 financial reporting templates. We have reduced the financial reporting and less administration with removal of reporting schedules and detailed reporting requirements. The department will continue reviewing further opportunities for red tape reduction and streamlined reporting. The focus on Alberta Education grant funding and how public dollars are spent. Compensation levels will be comparable to the public school system, and proposed levels will not impact a large majority of the operators who are already operating within these requirements. Funds from private school sources, such as donations, tuition fees, and foundations, are not impacted by this change in the legislation. The development of a framework for the financial monitoring process. There's the identification of key areas that are monitored regularly, the monitoring process and the template used for monitoring purposes, sharing of recurring monitoring findings, and feedback confirmation when monitoring issues have been resolved. Finally, there's clear legislative authority to take action in cases where operators are non-compliant. So notification, probationary periods, further monitoring, funding holdbacks, or cancellation of accreditation if issues persist as determined by the ministry during our monitoring activities. And that is the end of our formal presentation. Those are the changes that are most notable for your areas. I see we do have a few questions that are coming in through our chat.
Is there something, there's a question that came in through the webinar chat. Is something new to have our financial report posted on our website? I believe that this is a requirement now. It was a best practice before, and I believe it's a requirement now. And when it comes to your financial report, I don't know if it needs to be posted directly on your website or just made available to
Eric, if you can go back to slide 16. One of the changes for public disclosure is that funded private schools must make publicly available the audited statement of operations, as well as financial policies developed for the start of 24-25. And a funded private school will be required to provide information to parents of enrolled students. So it's not that it has to specifically be on your website, but it does have to be publicly available. However you choose to do that will be, I suppose, up to the board. It does not say on the website, but publicly available, yes. I see a funding manual question. Soon, by mid-March, we were promised. As well as your funding profile sheets. So not specific to this, but yes, we understand that you are all waiting for those funding profiles and the funding manual, and they will be released soon.
Okay, the next question is statements of operations being publicly available. Does that mean wide open or to your parents?
Public is public.
As Aaron mentioned, it's as long as it's publicly available, and if there's a process for parents or I guess community members to request that information, then it just needs to be made publicly available if it's requested. The next question is, does the public disclosure include private ECS operators?
So back to that same slide, information regarding financial statements and senior management compensation, yes, must be made publicly available by November 30th of the 23-24 school year. And your policies and financial governance policies also must be made publicly available for the 24-25 school year. So yes.
Thank you very much for that question. Moving on to the next one. Will Alberta Ed provide policy templates to assist in developing the required policies? At this time, Alberta Education has not put together any template policies. I will make sure that we take that feedback back to the department and share that with us, and maybe that's something that we're looking at. I know that there's other resources available. I can't promise that this is something, but I believe that ASCA may have some template documents available if you are a member of their organization. The next question, I'll give this one to Aaron. Are the audited statement of operations different from audited financial statements?
I think the AFS is the ones that come from your accountants, and those will be your final ones, but that's probably a good question to take away to our financial reporting team.
Yeah, I believe the audited statement of operations is just one segment of your audited financial statements. The operations statement is just a portion. Okay, I see in the chat, ASCA will provide, David Eifert announced this from ASCA. ASCA will provide policy templates available to member schools to align with new regulations. I really appreciate that response from ASCA. Thank you for clarifying.
Thank you, David.
Moving on to the next question. Regarding ECS for home education, what regulation will be governing this? Aaron?
Both. So there will be, I mean, we already have the ECS regulation. It will most likely be updated at the same time that the home education regulation is updated next year. So those will, I'm sure work has already started on updating those regulations. So they should be announced shortly after the funding manual changes.
And a second part to that question, as there are not APS outcomes for ECS student, how will we be monitoring home education and what outcomes will apply?
And until we see the changes in the home education regulation, we won't know the answer to those questions. Recommendation to keep it as the same as you would for any other student, where you've got the student record regulation requirements met, as well as things like your notification form and your teacher progress. If you have a program plan or your teacher visits, just make sure those are all documented. But yes, until we see the changes to the actual regulation, we won't know the requirements.
Excellent. Next question. Can you talk more about the financial reporting of the new schedule for 2023, the one that only talks about Alberta Ed funding separate from other sources of revenue and spending?
Yeah, so one of the future sessions that we're hoping to have will be with our financial reporting and accountability team. So those questions I think we're going to save for the actual accountants that come in here, because they're the team that deals with your actual reporting.
What is the senior management compensation information that has to be made public to parents? When it comes to senior management compensation that needs to be publicly available, it would be a schedule that lists who your senior managers are and what their compensation level is. It would, and in terms of how detailed that would be, it'd be the name of the individual that's a senior manager, head of school, and what their compensation level is.
And just making sure that that is in line with the superintendent's regulation, because it does outline what you are allowed to pay people in terms of salary and benefits and bonuses, mostly that you can only pay them a salary. So just make sure to review the superintendent's regulation when you're making your offers to superintendents or your senior managers.
And then the next question is a very similar approach to the last one. Does this apply to the ECS operators? Yes, this does apply to the ECS operators.
Yes. Okay, so to confirm, the changes in compensation regulations are proportional to the level of funding. So if you're asking as a private school where you only get 70% of a typical one, that means that from that 70% that you are given, that's all that you can pay of the schedule that your superintendent is paid on. So just as a basic example, if you would normally pay them $100,000 in a public system and you only get funded 70% as a private school, they could only get paid up to $70,000 based on what you are given from the government. If you collect additional fees like tuition or just gifting and donations, any part of your gifting, donations, tuition can go into the other areas, but you can only use up to 70% of what the government gives you to go towards that salary.
Okay, how is this working regarding the compensation for management for ECS publicly available? Will there just be a range be reported? I don't think that this comes down to a range. I think that it's just a requirement that is in the regulation at this point, where if you're in that position, you have to be reporting the compensation for that role.
Dates for the follow-up sessions. No, we have not set dates for this yet. We will be in contact with ASCA to make sure that we can set those up. And so I would encourage you to, if you have feelings about this, do you like the lunch and learn session, or would you rather an end of day or first thing in the morning? We will try and accommodate preferences, but we wanted to do this first one as a lunch and learn to fit it into everyone's schedule, because especially in these type of schools, schedules are a little different than they might be in a public school. So just to get as many people in as possible, we just scheduled midday. So no, we do not have dates set yet, but we do have the next few topics listed that we'd like to go through. And one of those will be from our financial reporting and crew. And there will be one hopefully on PASI and student records as well. And Eric, can you remind me, did we have another one scheduled?
In terms of being scheduled, at this point, none of the three are scheduled. None of the three that are on the list are scheduled at this point. We need to put together some dates and reach out to ASCA to make sure that we're collaborating with them and make sure that our format and everything works. And so we're waiting to get a little bit of feedback from this presentation before we schedule the next three. I just wanted to touch on the compensation piece. I'm going to go back to slide 16 for a second. The rules for the funded independent schools and the rules for the ECS operators are slightly different. It's a 70% modifier on the independent school side, whereas with the ECS operators, it goes up to the full amount because you are 100% funded by Alberta Education. You're not receiving that 70% funding and still have the option for tuition. When it comes to your our senior management has an executive director. They're not a superintendent. Is this still necessary to report? If they are the top tier employee or a senior manager position within your organization that sees the organizational processes or oversight, that's the type of roles that are going to be included in this salary disclosure or compensation disclosure.
Yeah, and I think Eric just answered this home ed question about 100%. So yes, home education students receive 100% of the funding if they are in an ECS or just in regular home education. If it is home education done through a private school, they're only getting 70% of the home education grant. And so how does this affect the 70% criteria? There again, if you're bringing in ECS students, they will only get funded as a half FTE, so they will only get 35% of what a typical home education student would get in a regular public school.
If we include our audited statement of operations page from our AFS and senior management compensation in our AERR and post our AERR on our website, does that suffice for publicly available? I think it's just the audited statement of operations, and that needs to be made publicly available. So I think that would be compliant. And to be clear on that last question regarding putting your statement of operations for and the compensation on your website with your AERR, that would be adequate for private or for independent schools. However, for private ECSs, you have to submit or make publicly available the entirety of your audited financial statements, not just the statement of operations. That's you can see that on this page, the difference between these requirements.
I just see a follow-up to that home education funding as well. So for private schools, home education students get 100% of the home education funding. But because you're a part of a private school, the superintendent's salary would still be at that 70%. So there is a disconnect there between what you're getting funded and what you can pay your superintendent, because it's still 70% of what is coming from Alberta Education. But Eric, do you know if that changes because of the 100% home education funding?
I'm not
That-
100% certain on the home education.
Okay.
We'll
We'll
have
take
to
that back.
take a look, and then we'll provide an answer in the presentation that we publish. Maybe we can get an answer, Q&A, kind of FAQ at the back or something.
Yeah, we'll try and take all of these questions and sort of lump in some answers when we post it.
For the next question, where would we find superintendent lists of what we can pay your head of department? That would be included in, I think it's called Schedule 1 or Schedule A of the Superintendent of School Regulation. It includes kind of the pay that is available to superintendents and would be the baseline for what you can pay your heads of school or senior management. Is the list of required financial policies for 2024-25 conveniently available somewhere or to be found in the regulation? It's included in the regulation. Erin, do you remember which sections that was in the regulation? Oh, thank you very much for posting the link to the regulation.
No, each one is a different piece of the regulation. So, but it is labeled almost exactly like we have it in this presentation. So if you're going through looking for the financial policies, it is listed under financial policies in the regulation. I just don't have a copy of it in front of me to get the number. But we did try and use the same headers in our presentation as are in the regulation. Eric, I do see a question about titles for disclosure of compensation versus names of the people. Is there any requirement to actually name the people rather than just give their title?
I am just confirming with our financial reporting and accountability branch. I will respond to that momentarily.
Perfect.
It said, or the response I got is you are not required to disclose the names. So just the title would be adequate, I believe.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for clarifying on that question. That's a really good one. So titles for disclosure and compensation, and then you're not required to disclose names. Is the funding for superintendent pay applicable to DSEPs with students funded as severe disabilities? I'm not 100% sure on this question. I may need a little bit of clarification on that one. The superintendent pay is just the 70% modifier off of what's allowable for or under the superintendent of schools regulation.
And yeah, this isn't real clear in the regulation. The audited statement of operations effective for the start of 23-24 school year. Does that mean it's actually the 22-23 financial statement that has to be made available? Because that's the only one that will be available as of the start of the 23-24 school year. And I think the answer to that is yes, you have to put your most recent financial statements publicly available as of November 2023. So whatever your most recent year end is has to be publicly posted by November 2023.
We got some clarification on the previous question about DSEPs. Does the 70% modifier apply? Yes. As an independent school, the 70% modifier applies, but that is applicable only to the Alberta Education-based funding. You can still use other funding that you receive through donations or any other method to top up pay if that's something that your organization is looking at doing. So there's another question here. I'm looking at the superintendent schedule. As a private ECS, our name is not on the list. Do I then look at the public board in our area? No, that's not how the superintendent regulation for compensation component works. It's just based off of level 5. So whatever on that chart, it will say kind of a different level for the different boards. Look at the compensation range for the level 5 boards. That's what your all independent schools are based off of. So just to clarify, on the Schedule 1 within the Superintendents of School Regulation, you're going to look at the range for the level 5 superintendent pay or compensation, and it would be 70% of that range. All independent schools, all are baselined off of the level 5. As a private school, only the statement of operations made available for public or to the whole audit report. For private schools or independent schools, it's only the statement of operations that's required by the regulation. Jumping back over to the questions and answers, Vic Weens asked, however, we do receive 100% funding for special ed. As a DSEP, yes, you would receive 100% funding if you are a DSEP. However, you are still benchmarked at that 70% limit from Alberta Education dollars on your senior management compensation. Okay. Does the 70% senior management compensation come out of a particular envelope of Alberta Ed funding or just overall funding?
I think it's just overall funding, just from the general revenue fund, because it's not targeted. The majority is not targeted. So, so for instance, your transportation dollars are targeted to transportation. So this doesn't come into play there, but the majority of the funding you get from Alberta Education is going to be for the general revenue of classroom costs. And I think it only comes out of that larger portion. We should probably take that away and just make sure that it comes out of there. But
okay. And just as a piece of clarification on that, the level for the senior management for independent schools, you're baselined off of the level 5. And for private ECS, you are baselined off of level 2 on the superintendent chart. Okay, I see a question from Vic. With funding coming from home ed, Vic, if you can send me an email directly, I will see if I'll send you an email just to touch base on your question, as it seems to be a very specific one to your individual organization. ECS would be 100% of level 2, I believe. Yeah. And then private schools or independent schools are 70% of level 5.
These are some really great questions that we're getting. We really didn't know what to expect coming into this, so we really appreciate you guys just asking all of these questions, because as a brand new presentation that we're giving, these are really good feedback for areas that we can maybe put a little more information into the presentation if we ever have to give this again.
You bet.
Yeah.
I see a question. Can secretary treasurers be the same person as the financial manager? Yes, there's no limits on what the roles are for people within your organizations. We recognize that many of your organizations are small and a person can wear many hats within an organization. And so it can be the same person.
I do think, though, there is a rule that the superintendent and the secretary treasurer cannot be the same person.
Yeah.
So just that one relationship, you do have to have 2 separate people.
Okay. We have a board who are not paid anything, a principal who teaches 0.82 with admin 0.18, myself as a VP who teaches 0.84 with admin at 0.16, who is considered senior management. If you've got anyone that's in that management role for the organization, and I'm not sure if your organization even has anyone being compensated for that type of role. If there isn't, then you wouldn't have to disclose anything, especially for small operators.
So yeah, a question about roles again. Can one person be the superintendent, principal, and head of school? Traditionally, I think principals and heads of school are the same person. As for being a superintendent, I think that yes, they can also be the superintendent, again, as long as you have a separate secretary treasurer or treasurer in that other role, just so that we do have some accountability for more than one person running an entire school. You do have to have at least that second person in your senior management.
Yeah. Senior manager is actually defined in the regulations. So if you've got any doubts on if a role would fit into the senior management category, you can always look in the beginning of the interpretation section of the regulation. For specific positions, you would be in the best position to determine if they would be considered a senior manager or not within your organization. You would know the roles and responsibilities and how that relates to the regulation. I encourage you to take a look at the regulation to see what the definition is of a senior manager.
Yeah, and if you have something so specific as a person who is a half-time superintendent and a quarter-time teacher, you're still held to that 70% of whatever FTE they're working. So they still have to be multiplied by that 0.7, no matter what their FTE is. So if they're a half-time FTE for your organization, they would only be paid at half of that 70% multiplier. A question? Oh, sorry, Eric.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Just moving on, there's one here about half-day kindergarten governed under a 0.5 ECS and a 0.5 ECE. I would just like a little more clarification on the ECE. Are we talking about the daycare portion? Because our funding would only go towards the ECS portion of what you're being funded. So like I said, if they're a half-time staff for ECS, and they would only be paid at that 0.5 level from Alberta Education funding, and anything coming from the daycare portion of it would be under something different, unless I'm not understanding that. Yeah. Yeah, so our funding only goes towards the ECS programming. And so that's where those dollars have to be spent. Anything outside of the ECS program would be handled separately.
It doesn't matter if we aren't hitting the minimum salary in the level 2. There's no requirement to make it up to that salary. That is it's kind of the maximum that we're concerned about when it comes to independent schools and private ECSs. The minimum amount is not a requirement.
We really do look forward to seeing you all again, and possibly having a few of our friends from other areas. And thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a really good learning opportunity for us, as well as I hope you have gotten something out of this session as well.